Hey, my name is James, and in this video, I'm going to show you the pros and cons for sending different types of processing, or none at all, to your monitor mixing system. And if you stick around to the end, I'll show you how to do it on a few different popular consoles. If you have the same console feeding both front of house and your monitor mixers, either personal monitor mixers or you're using aux sends, you need to know what processing that's done at front of house is actually being sent to the monitors, and you need to know why that's important and how that affects how your musicians are hearing themselves. Because when your team can hear themselves really well, they'll play and sing their best. And your mix at front of house gets a lot better when they're playing and singing their best. Hey, if you're new here, my name is James and I help worship leaders, church sound techs, and tech directors eliminate the mystery and frustration of sound at church. So if that's you and you haven't subscribed yet, consider hitting that subscribe button and welcome to the club of Sound Ninjas. Before we can really understand what's being sent to the monitors, you have to understand the signal flow of an input channel. This is the order in which different processors are applied to the signal at different points in the chain. And depending on your board, you might be able to send none, some, or all of that processing to your monitor mixer. The first thing in the chain is the preamp, and this will affect everything downstream. A lot of consoles will also include the high-pass filter as one of the things that gets sent no matter what. So you have to know your console to know whether or not that's going to affect your monitor mixers. Next up are usually gates or expansion, or a way to push down the noise that you don't want so that the microphone or input only opens up after the signal reaches a certain threshold. Next up are EQ and compression, and most of the time on your board, they're sent either as one unit, not one or the other. Sometimes you can switch the order on your console on whether the EQ or compressor is first, but not always. Another processor that might be in your signal path is the insert. This is where we might insert rack effects or plugins, but you want to know whether or not this insert is being sent to your monitor mixers or not. The insert send and return can also be at any of these points, so learning this for the monitor mixer pickoffs can really help if you're doing some more advanced routing as well with applying an insert into your input channel. Finally, we have the fader and the mute. Normally for our monitor mixers, we don't want to include the fader adjustments, but we might want to include the mute button so that something doesn't pop through people's in-ears by accident. That could be really painful for somebody, and we don't want to do that. Now, if you have a separate console for your monitor mixers, this is not really the same discussion because you get to choose on that console exactly what processing gets sent to the monitors, and it's just for the monitors. But if we're running front of house and monitors from the same console, which is probably the majority of you, there are some benefits to maybe sending some processing to your monitor mixers, and here's the first one. It's the high pass filter and low pass filter. These can get rid of unwanted frequencies that nobody needs in particular inputs. So thinking about the bass guitar, you don't necessarily need a lot of top end on the bass guitar, and so if your low pass filter is sent to the monitors, that can reduce a lot of the fret clang or noise that's not necessarily needed, and it makes more room for things that really do need top end, like the cymbals. On the flip side, and what most consoles have, is the high-pass filter, where we can easily get rid of unwanted rumble and even some of the subharmonic information that doesn't need to be in a particular instrument. The rub comes when we use the high-pass filter to thin out an instrument so that it fits well at front of house, but it might take out too much of the body of that instrument for what the musician or singer wants to hear on stage. If that's the case, you might make a compromise in your mixing style at front of house and use the high pass filter a little bit and then use a low shelf a little bit more to take out more of the low end that you don't necessarily want to hear at front of house, but helps their input feel full on stage. The next thing we need to think about is whether or not to send EQ. Sometimes EQ can make an instrument sound right, and the things that you're fixing at front of house are also really beneficial at monitors. The input that comes to mind here are drums, because to get the modern rock sound, you really have to dump out a lot of mid-range from the drums to get them to sound right and full and exciting. When the drums sound big, musicians are more inspired to play and sing well. So if you send EQ on your drums from front of house to the monitors, that can make things feel bigger and make people play with a little bit more energy. On vocals, the proximity effect, or the low frequency bass boost that happens when you move a directional microphone close to a sound source, that can make the vocals actually sound more cluttered. So if you can pull out some of that proximity effect that's going toward the monitors, then people can feel like the vocals feel more natural, and they can actually keep them lower in their mix and still intelligible, so that everyone can make their adjustment on that channel. Another time when sending processing from front of house to the monitor mixers might not be helpful is if the room EQ sounds really weird and we're trying to correct for anomalies in our speakers or acoustics with our channel EQ, and then that makes the input channels themselves sound a little bit weird. If we're sending that processing back to the person on stage, they might feel like their instrument or their input is quite inadequate now, or sounds funny and not quite how they imagined it should be sent to the front of house console. If you're not careful, this can end up making it so that somebody is adjusting to the processing that they're hearing from front of house, and then we get a little less boxy, and then we get a little more boxy, and then it can turn into a big mess. If you have an input that's very, very dynamic, using compression can help tame that dynamic range by pushing down the peaks so that you can turn up the overall level without hurting somebody. That can be helpful for monitors as well, but the rub comes when we use too much compression at front of house, or compression that's suitable for a front of house mix sometimes can translate into a dynamic mismatch on stage. What I mean by this is when the singers are singing quietly, the vocals are very loud, but when the singers are singing very loud, the vocals seem very quiet. If you're a band on stage and you're trying to follow the dynamics of your lead vocal, you might have a harder time when this happens, and so that might be a reason to not send compression to your monitor mix if you like to compress that much at front of house. Another problem with sending compression back to the monitors is if it's too compressed, the singer or musician can feel like they're not really hitting the dynamics that they need to, and then they end up pushing harder than they should. They can end up damaging their vocal cords or even playing their instrument outside of its natural dynamic range where it actually sounds its best. Now, there is a way around this if you want to compress a little bit on the input channel and then bus all your vocals to a group that's just sent to front of house and compress a little bit more there on your way to the stereo bus. Now, that brings me to another point that you have to think about. Some consoles will differ in the way that they send a signal to an aux send versus what they send via a direct output. An aux send lets you combine a bunch of different channels and send to an output, and that output might be the personal monitor mixer and having a channel there, or it could be the entire mix. So we have to think about the way that our console is set up that way. This is different than a direct output, which has a single channel going to a single input, and this should typically arrive at a personal monitor mixer. So now let's dive into a few different ways that different consoles will send the signal to an aux send. And we'll start with aux sends first. On the PreSonus Studio Live Series 3 consoles, you basically have three options of where you can send your aux sends. It can be pre-1, pre-2, or post. So on the PreSonus Studio Live Series 3 consoles, here's how you choose what you get out of your aux send. So we've got our handheld channel. If we're wanting to send it to, say, mix 1, select mix 1, and here on the screen we can see that it's got aux 1 selected. The other way to do this, if we're on our main mix, if we go to aux inputs, mix effects masters, we can select it here as well. But when we have aux 1, we're going to touch this little gear wheel. We can see aux pre mode, pre-1, pre-2, or post. Pre-1 means none of the fat channel processing, pre-2 means that it comes after the fat channel processing, and post means that it comes after all the fat channel processing and the fader adjustments. Now, we probably don't want post fader if we're already mixing front of house on there, because then our fader adjustments would be reflected into the monitor mixers, and we want to separate our creative control at front of house from what they're getting in their monitors, so we don't want to do post. Now you can switch this over to subgroup mode, which is post fader and post everything else, and there's no additional fader adjustment. It's just assigned or not assigned, so that you could do parallel processing or series processing if you wanted. But for most of our monitor mixes, we're going to leave it on aux mode so that we can either choose to have some or none of the processing, and preferably none of the fader movements as well. This is set up at the aux send level, not at the individual channel level. For the direct outputs, if we're running to a personal monitor mixer from the PreSonus consoles, we go again to the gear wheel on the input channel, and you can say digital send options. This is either over USB or AVB. I believe that's where both of them are originating from, and we can do pre or post, meaning pre-processing, probably straight off the preamp, or post-processing, which includes all the fat channel options there. It's kind of a take it or leave it thing. Here you can see that we can choose the channel's input, pre-EQ, post-EQ, pre-fader, post-fader, or change it to a subgroup, to the X32 and M32. A subgroup doesn't allow you to vary the channel fader level at all, it's only just post-fader. Post-fader is just that, and we've described already why we don't want that. Pre-fader means all of the channel processing, EQ, compression, gate, everything. Whereas post-EQ sends the EQ, but not the compression. Pre-EQ means that it's not sending the EQ, but it is sending the gate or expander, and then the input has the gain and the high-pass filter only. If you're using the M32 edit program, you can see this little globe symbol here, and that means that the changes that you make to a certain input channel will be global across all the channels that are sent to that aux send. So if you wanted to send all of your drums post EQ, but you wanted to send your vocals just post high pass filter, you could do that and have it separated per channel. If you have personal monitor mixers, you can assign an aux send to be an input to these personal monitor mixers, and I often do that for an entire drum kit. However, most of the time you're going to use direct outputs to feed those personal monitor mixers, and so let's talk about how we send those outputs from the PreSonus Studio Live Series 3 consoles. That product is a mouthful. On digital patching, you select where the AVB outputs go to, and you can consult your manual on what inputs are going to show up for those personal monitor mixers. On the input channels, hit the gear wheel, and then you can select whether your digital send is either pre or post for your fat channel processing. Now, I don't have any AVB units to test this, but if it's similar to the way that the output goes for your USB output, then the high pass filter is not included in the pre. On the X32, I prefer to use the X32 edit rather than the on-screen interface. You can see they gave us some very nice colors and a color code to figure out what goes where. You can see that each of the options can or not include the mute as well. So if you want it to go from the input channel, but you want it to be cut when the channel is muted, you can select that. You can choose the input, pre-EQ and compression, but after the gate, post-EQ and compression, and looking at the config page, you can see where those pickoff points are when you look at the insert points. On the Allen & Heath SQ series, you can patch a socket directly to the input for their ME1 or ME500 personal monitor mixers. This has no processing at all. It's really just taking it from the preamp straight to the mixer. Your other option is a direct output. The direct output pickoff point is global for the entire console, so you can't switch it up like you can on the X32 and M32. It's kind of like communist jokes. They're not good unless everybody gets it the same. I'll show you a little screenshot from their reference guide, but post preamp, this signal is only affected by the preamp gain. This would be the same as patching a socket as to the direct out. Post high pass filter also has the high pass filter. We can do post gate, post insert return, post PEQ or parametric equalizer, or post comp, so it's affected by the compressor, or post delay, which is affected by the channel's input delay. That's not like post-delay effects. It's kind of cool that you can separate EQ or compression in these direct outs, but it's kind of lame that everybody gets it the same. For the Allen & Heath SQ series, there are a few places where the aux send can pick off that channel. It can be right off the input, meaning no processing at all. You can be post-insert return, which means it includes the high-pass filter and the gate. Or it can be post-EQ, which doesn't include the compression, or post-delay, which includes all the processing that precedes it. So your high-pass filter, gate, EQ, and compression. It also has an all pre and all post button that can affect every channel sent to that aux send, so that can be helpful if you're trying to make it all pre-fader all at once. Now I know this got pretty nerdy and we got a little bit down in the weeds, but Hopefully it was helpful for you to understand what the differences are and why you might make different decisions on what processing to send to monitors. One time I was helping a church and the front of house techs felt handcuffed because they couldn't use compression on vocals because too much compression being sent to the in-ear monitor mixers was throwing their singers off. When we changed one little setting and finally they were free to use as much compression as they needed at front of house, the singers on stage were happy and the front of house techs were happy. So it can be really helpful when you get these little settings right. If you made a change because of this video and things are easier for you now, let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If you want to understand your sound system more fully, from all the way to the beginning, all the way to the end, you can enroll in my Attaway Audio Academy and take the Amateur to Pro course. I walk you through the entire sound system so you can know what piece affects what in the right order and how to troubleshoot and get yourself out of a pinch when something goes wrong. If you like this video, mash that thumbs up and hit the subscribe button to see more videos like this. You can find more information about Attaway Audio Academy through the link below or go to attawayaudio.com/academy. Remember, it's all about the low end, avoid the sound tech solo, and nobody leaves church humming the kick drum. We'll see you back here next time on Attaway Audio.